Let justice roll down like water, righteousness like a mighty stream, for our grandsons and granddaughters. Remember to remember the dream. Welcome to Songs and Stories from Home as we continue to remember the dream. This week, June 11th, 1963. This Black Lives Matter moment in 2020 America is different in some significant ways from the civil rights movement of the 1960s, beginning with the contrast in the role of the federal government. These days, the Senate chooses to remain silent and on the sidelines. A Supreme Court ruling dismantles important parts of the Voting Rights Act, disenfranchising large swaths of once eligible voters. Rather than stand with those fighting for racial justice, the president threatens to use the United States military against them. A trained army against unarmed citizens. Instead of using the power of the federal government to create a more perfect union, the president calls Black Lives Matter a symbol of hate, while using the power of his office to protect symbols of this country's racial divide. It was not always so. On June 11th, 1963, President John F. Kennedy worked with the governor of Alabama to safely enroll black students at that state's largest university. It would be the first time in our nation's history that universities in every state of the Union were desegregated. Many will argue that the struggle continues to make sure those institutions become truly integrated. Later that same evening, President Kennedy spoke to the nation, putting his personal prestige and the power of the presidency behind the idea that we are all created equal. It was a turning point for the movement. After watching the president's speech in the offices of the Mississippi NAACP, Medgar Evers returned to his Jackson home. As a safety precaution, there was no entrance at the front of the house. That evening, Evers went to the back of the car to retrieve some T-shirts. Byron de la Beckwith was hiding in the woods across the street with a high-powered rifle. Before going on these pilgrimages, I was somewhat familiar with each of those events, all of them significant in the civil rights struggle. What I could not have told you is that they all happened in the course of a single day, June 11th, 1963. Let justice roll down like water, righteousness like a mighty stream, for our grandsons and granddaughters. Remember to remember the dream. Our pilgrimage visited the campus of the University of Alabama. Arthurine Lucy briefly enrolled and integrated that school in 1956, only to be expelled for her own safety. Gathering at the doorway of Foster Hall, we learned that on June 11th, 1963, Governor Wallace stood at those doors at the hall in a grandstander's attempt to halt the enrollment of two black students, Vivian Malone and James Hood. His defiance cemented his reputation as a crusader for segregation, and it became known as the stand in the schoolhouse door. The reality is, once his point was made, George Wallace stepped aside, and the students peacefully walked by him. They were enrolled, and the university was finally integrated. And we were then told, as we were standing there, that where we were standing is now known as the Malone Hood Plaza. And behind us was the Arthurine Lucy clock tower. And we all turned to see what the right side of history can look like. A few hours after Wallace stepped aside, President Kennedy addressed the nation. "This country is founded," he said, "on the idea that the rights of all are diminished when the rights of one citizen are threatened. We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the Scriptures and as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated. This nation, for all of its hopes and all of its boasts, will not truly be free until all of its citizens are free. We face a moral crisis. A great change is at hand. And though a change may have been at hand, the day was not over." In Jackson, Mississippi, Medgar Evers, a married father of three, 37 years old, a World War II veteran, state field secretary for the NAACP, drove home after watching the president's speech. He pulled into the carport. For safety, the house was designed with only a side door. That night, Evers went to the back of the car to remove some T-shirts. Printed on them, "Jim Crow must go." And as he did, he was shot by someone hiding in the bushes across the street. Rushed to the hospital, he was refused entry because of his race. Eventually, he became the first African American admitted to an all-white hospital, a distinction coming too late to save his life. He was buried on June 19th in Arlington Cemetery with full military honors before more than 3,000 mourners. The killer was arrested, acquitted by an all-white jury, blacks excluded because jurors were drawn from a pool of voters, and blacks were denied the right to vote. 30 years later, the killer was retried and found guilty of murder. The Evers family home is now a national monument, and when the pilgrimage visited, it was chilling to stand in the driveway and stare across the street to where the assassin hid and shot Medgar Evers like an animal. Man's inhumanity to man. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal with certain unalienable rights. Among these, life. When will we ever learn? How many years must a mountain exist before it is washed to the sea? And how many years must some people exist before they're allowed to be free? And how many times can a man turn his head and pretending he just doesn't see? The answer, my friend, is blowing in the wind. The answer is blowing